When backups run as a background process on your computer, you cannot use your computer that well compared to the backup processes not running, because a certain amount of the processing power goes towards running the backup program. But of course, the backup is something that infinitely small, ideally, would be created at any point in time, because if you then otherwise create a backup, for example, in a given week, then the problem is that if you lose access to the data outside of the week and not directly after the backup was created, then you have the potential problem of having lost a lot of data. Now, sleep could be the exact same thing. The exact same principle now applies to the backups. What if the backups are actually, or what if it made sense to therefore take the backups? All these processes that have to be run on an infinitely small schedule, but enlarge the frequency at which they are run from an infinitely small time unit to a given unit of a day, for example, then what you would effectively do is you would maximize the processing power that is available for the amount at which the user needs this processing power, and you would consolidate the rest into this whole period at which you could just run the backup because you don't use the computer anyway. And you cannot use the computer anyway if it is night. Of course, you could also develop as an evolutionary designer something like night vision, which then would allow us to do things at night basically, but it also would come at the cost of developing and keeping up the night vision, and it would also run the cost of seeing way less than in the day. It would also come at the cost of not having this time available and then potentially having to run these regenerative processes basically all the time. Running these backup processes all the time is not something that is very useful in terms of accessing the maximum amount of processing power. Now, the processing power I spoke about is actually our intelligence, our processing power. Even though I would define processing power not equal to intelligence, but intelligence just as a raw problem-solving capability, whereas processing power is only one of the parameters that leads to intelligence. If, for example, you had a very low intelligence and you added infinite time, then even this very low intelligence could potentially figure out something, at least in theory. But if you take only processing power and an infinite amount of time, then you don't get anything. At least to how I define these words in my mind. Now, applying this reasonable strategy of outsourcing, not in place and in entity, but in time, all these processes that have to be run constantly, because otherwise the backup is just not there if the backup is actually needed. And consolidating them to a given time, in a given time frame, that is the day, and therefore the night, would allow us to achieve much higher levels of intelligence than compared to the scenario at which we would have to run all these processes all the time. Just think of 8 hours of your brain running constantly, basically, when you are asleep, and having this to fit in with the 16 hours you are awake. Now, if we assume that at every given point in time the brain uses the same kind of raw processing power, and we would try to fit in 8 hours of sleep time, of the regenerative processes that are done in our sleep time, and try to fit them into our daytime, then we, I think, could assume that you reduce, because 8 divided by 16 or 8 divided by 24 is actually just a third of the overall time that we have in a given day, then we could assume that we would decrease our intellectual ability at any given point in time by 33%. If you take an average intelligent human, then you would effectively reduce, now equaling or assuming that we equal intelligence and IQ and standardize it to 100 points also, like IQ, then, and also the contribution, not the contribution, but the units, basically, the increase and the decrease would be basically identical to IQ, then you would effectively lower a person's IQ, with the average IQ being 100, by 33 points, effectively lowering the IQ to the smartest monkeys at an IQ coming in at 67, which in terms of how we rate, or in terms of how the classification of IQ generally defines people below 70, it would be borderline deficiency. Above borderline deficiency, more intelligence, would be dullness. 85 to 115 would be normal. 115 to 130 superior, and so on and so on. Of course, these interpretations vary a little bit from interpretation to interpretation, but below 70, 67 as an IQ would be borderline deficiency. It would effectively turn us from the intelligent beings that we are, into beings that are basically borderline deficient, into basically psychologically impaired humans. So humans we nowadays consider as psychologically impaired, at least in terms of the IQ score, if we measure intelligence in the IQ score, even though the IQ score is often very heavily discussed and also can be obviously used in order to create different classes of people and also potentially relate the worth of people. This is the potential negative thing you can do with something like IQ, and that's probably also why this whole intelligence discussion is something that is not very cancel safe. A large number of studies on intelligence are actually, not a large number, but I know of a specific topic, a specific category of intelligence that is basically almost completely ghosted from science, because it is just so risky to actually do this kind of science, because you would be cancelled. You will probably be tried to be cancelled by so many people. But that's not what I will try to do here. What I wanted to try to do was to create basically a scenario in which we would implement the sleep, the regenerative power of sleep, into just the regeneration task that sleep provides us, or is, into our basically daily given time. But now what we also have to see is that even though we would now be borderline deficient in terms of intelligence, we also could run 24 hours. Of course, we would also have to gather a lot more calories, because we don't burn calories when we sleep. We also would have to find a lot more to do. But at least in terms of evolution probably found out that it made sense to have fewer very intelligent hours compared to us running all the time but not being as intelligent, being 33% less intelligent given the assumptions we made.